This is a slight upgrade from the Atari ST version, although not much if I'm honest with you. The Commodore Amiga's version is a complete embarrassment to the Amiga computer, and I would likely say it was also one of the worst, if not the worst Amiga arcade conversions I've ever played in this series so far. Hit collision detection seldom works here, probably on par with the ST's version to be fair. I mean, it kind of looks the part like the ST version, it's just not executed very nicely at all. Something with this version that the ST didn't have is the crowd on the right and left hand sides of the screen. Going back to controls though, really again just like the Atari ST version, this game just wants to respond when it feels like doing so. Even picking up weapons from the ground to use in fights seemed like a task to do this. It's one of those types of games that you would have bought at a time for around £30 to £40, played it for 5 minutes in complete horror, and then raged at yourself for being conned by the box artwork that totally made you believe that this was going to be just like the arcade game, which it truly wasn't. The Commodore Amiga's conversion, released in 1989 by Activision 2, is a very infuriating play. Teams of zombies, creatures, and hawks will come at you all in one go and leave you fighting for dear life in a corner somewhere. The scrolling pace of this version is acceptable, and it even has a nice opening similar to the original arcade game. No music, just sound effects, which are average for this style game. Visually, I have seen so much better on the Amiga. This is a little on the pixelated side. It is also a version that has gone much darker in contrast compared with most other ports. Collision detection appears to be satisfactory with this port. I actually did not have the patience to go through the full stage because the difficulty level was just ridiculously hard with the Amiga port of this. Really, this conversion is very punishing. It just takes away that whole fun aspect of playing it in the first place. I once had this on the Amiga back in the day. It had around 4 discs, but one of those discs was broken, so never did get around to playing it. This monstrosity was released by, wait for it, yes, US Gold back in 1992. This was for ECS as well as older OCS model Amigas. Neither was particularly wonderful. Firstly, my character of choice has and always been Ryu, and has remained since. Ryu is extremely awkward to control in this, whilst I was put up against Chun-Li. I was attempting to pull off special moves, but simply did not happen. The colours looked like they had been faded away from age, or did this port always look this dull? One redeeming feature is voice, and that sounds fairly similar to the arcade original. Collision detection was just a mess. I found sometimes I hit Chun-Li to find that the health bar didn't even decrease. It's tragic to see such a capable machine that was once so far ahead of anything else was reduced to this trash. It's not particularly an enjoyable version to play either, but I suppose for those who didn't have a Super Nintendo or a Super Famicom back in '92, you would have possibly loved this just to say you had a copy of it. Who knows, I checked through Amiga Power magazine issue 22 from 1993, and they actually said, and I will quote, "I reckon you're going to be impressed with this." And then they had the cheek to score this 74% too. Just like I was hoping that Commodore 64 would have a really good version for the 8-bit computer versions, I was hoping the same for Amiga, but all I can say is that this is pretty much the same as the Atari ST conversion, only slightly faster with frame rates and more brightly coloured, although this is no doubt a dark game for the Amiga too. The Amiga in ST ports had something in common, those damn dogs who chase after you and having to click the joystick down twice very quickly to duck and shoot them. It's very annoying. Again, this version opens up with the same music as ST's port, just a slight upgrade, and like I say, generally the same game. It could have been so much better for the Amiga, but this is what Ocean gave us in this 1990 release. No cool arrival to stages by car, and incredibly and unnecessarily difficult to play from the get-go. To be fair, the Amiga version of Final Fight isn't as bad as some will make it out to be. The game is deemed that bad that a coder recently made an enhanced version of it. Yes, by far not perfect, and yes, the control scheme is pretty messy. For example, the jump kick, you need to be moving whilst pressing the action button, which is pretty strange. Problem is that I found myself jumping more than I needed to. Color-wise, the source material by Capcom is a fairly vibrant looking game. The Amiga port is fairly washed out though. The boss at the end of stage 1 who whistles doesn't whistle to call his chums around. In fact, he doesn't jump backwards onto the wall either whilst his gang attacks you. That awesome part where enemies walk out of doors to fight you is also missing, and there is no introduction to stage 1 either. Instead, the game randomly starts and places you direct into a fight without any warning at all. Collision detection is average, not perfect by any means. The Amiga version by far could have been a lot better than this, especially given how colourful some Amiga games are. The conversion also lets you choose between 3 characters, just like the arcade original did. Commodore Amiga got a version of Flying Shark in 1988, also by Firebird. I was very disappointed with the performance and visuals with this game. Firstly, I felt that sprites were a little bigger than most versions, and there wasn't much maneuver room in the gameplay area to avoid things hitting you. And of course, providing this version with a long vertical ratio look of the game wasn't actually done here. It wasn't an easy game to play because of these things, and when enemies are firing at you, bullet sizes just seemed way too big, which added to the difficulty level. It does show obvious raindrops, and these do tend to dip more as the screen gets busier with multiple sprites. In terms of colour, it's average, nothing really to boast about here. The music and sound effects here are also average. There's a hell of a lot better on the Commodore Amiga with vertical scrolling shoot 'em ups. Now, what can I say about the Commodore Amiga's 1988 port by Ace? Well, yep, it looks really faithful to the arcade version without a doubt. It's not overly high and bright contrasty colours, weapons are great to use, killing aliens is very nice too with their dying animations. Nothing wrong here at all really apart from that damn scrolling. Again, although not as bad as some of the other parts so far, the Commodore Amiga version still thinks that having a more fluid screen that moves quicker and exposing more of the maps isn't a big deal for this game. It really is, and it totally ruins the gameplay like most other versions. Something else with the Amiga port is the occasional frame drops. Not as bad as the Atari ST, but just such a shame, just like the Commodore 64 conversion could have done so much better. If you don't know much about 16-bit computers, then don't let this Commodore Amiga conversion make you think this is the best it can do in terms of racing games. Now, Lotus was released a year prior to this trash and easily wipes the floor with this version. For those of you more knowledgeable with 16-bit computers, and specifically the Commodore Amiga, you will likely agree with me this is a complete shambles of a conversion. Sure, it is an upgrade visually from everything else so far, although it is missing a lot of scenery, but this can be forgiven as games like this often had cutbacks to make things run faster. I really think though, after playing this version, they should have just cut back the entire idea of even porting this full stop. It's way too choppy to really be enjoyable, and when you think you are getting somewhere, some annoying object in the middle of the road hits you over. Turning in this game is fairly terrible. There really is no sense of enjoyment with this game. It's just so awful. You might have thought we would have had extra features for a 16-bit system, such as sirens. Not with this version, you don't. The Commodore Amiga port of Renegade contains something very noticeable when playing. That 4-bar rock and roll music has been replaced with something almost ungodly. Possibly the developers thought that the music just sounded far too dated for this Amiga game. Who knows? Now on with this conversion, surely a step up, and we generally get all gang members here, which is overwhelming, which was the original arcade game's intention. A gang of chaps thugs is very intimidating, and this is where the game works so well, that life or death scenario. Issue with the Amiga port is largely its bad control mechanics. I have played many versions using just one action button or 2 buttons and have managed to play fairly well, but this port just didn't translate those over too well. Collision detection is also way off here too. For a powerful 16-bit computer from that era, the boss isn't even animated. This isn't a great Amiga game by any means. To be honest with you, the Commodore Amiga version isn't too much better than the ST conversion. It looks slightly nicer than the ST port and also seems a tiny little bit more responsive, but it still isn't really much fun to play. The issue with the conversion is partly the size of other cars, which make you crash and are very hard to take over other cars whilst you're racing. The music quality is a notable step up from the Atari ST port, but really it just lacks what Turbo OutRun is, that sense of speed and good precision when turning corners. Another half-baked port by US Gold. Truth be told, I was expecting the Amiga's conversion to be superior to the Atari ST version. Reason being is that the Amiga, technically speaking, handles scrolling sprites much better. The Amiga also had more colours than the Atari ST. I am convinced that the Atari ST version and this version are virtually the same in terms of colours used. They look so close, it's almost like Teratex used the same game on Amiga or vice versa. Now the stupid thing here is that because of Amiga's larger colour palette in handling of scrolling, you might think that this would look and scroll better. Firstly, the Amiga's ability to make games look better hasn't or doesn't appear to have been considered here. For an Amiga game and of this version's release, it doesn't particularly look like a premium game. In fact, for an Amiga game, it looks terrible. What's even more shocking with this release is that explosions when blowing up huts or bosses look so pixelated and just terrible. Even these elements look the same as the ST's version in that respect. In terms of scrolling controls, this is the only real notable difference here. Although it does struggle to keep up a steady frame rate, it is much faster and more responsive than the ST's offering. Music and sound effects here aren't particularly wonderful either. It's below an average shooter for the Commodore Amiga. There is also a bug with this version, so once all your lives are gone, the game screen shows a continue countdown, even though we can't actually continue at this point. Amiga Format issue 25 from 1991 rated this conversion with a 72%, indicating at the time that it was a mediocre game, nothing special. Next up, we have the Commodore Amiga conversion. I would like to say this played well, as it doesn't actually look that bad at all. However, as I was playing this, I did start to notice that hitting the enemies was often pretty useless, as collision detection was fairly poor. A good thing was that unlike previous versions of this game, I could actually climb the ladder if I wanted to midway through the first mission. I found the controls a little non-responsive in this port when attempting to flying kick enemies. It sporadically happened without me being aware it was about to happen. Elbowing enemies seemed like that most effective way of knocking people down. A Bobo actually breaks through the wall in this port, which is a nice touch from the arcade classic. We have no music in this version, just pretty dull sounding sound effects. Not as bad as the C64 versions, but still pretty irritating. One thing that stuck out like a sore thumb was my character. Billy's face had his mouth constantly open. Kinda looked like he was constantly in shock. The scrolling on this version was a little bad too, where to progress I would have to walk very, very close to the side of the screen to get further into the stage. Let's take everything that the Atari ST conversion had and make it a little better. So firstly, with this Commodore Amiga release, the scrolling and movement is fairly smooth here. It is much brighter to look at too. Regretfully, even though the Amiga was fully capable of doing parallax scrolling, this didn't have any, which is pretty pitiful considering its older brother, the Commodore 64, actually did this. One bonus that I was really grateful with this version of the game was the actual sounds. The music was average and the canine barking sounds and dying sounds too was done properly, so no longer did my ears bleed. It's almost the same scenario which the Spectrum and Amstrad version had, virtually the same game but just a little better on another platform. Is this a great game or even a great version of Shadow Dancer? Hell no. I don't think any system had a decent home conversion, but working through each trashy version told me that out of everything, the Amiga likely had the best version. Very unlikely one of the worst Commodore Amiga arcade conversions of all time. As you can see here, not only does this look as slow paced as the Atari ST's version, but I'm actually convinced it is the Atari ST version, only better coloured and improved sound. In other words, a direct port of the Atari ST game, or vice versa, I'm not sure of that. Either way, the only reason this is above the ST's release is because of the brighter colours and better sound. This is a slow to play and just isn't much fun at all, pretty much like everything else so far. Something I will note here, just like the ST's version, both will prevent you from shooting, or at least really slow down when there's too much happening at once on the screen at the same time. As poor as the Commodore 64 version was, even that could manage to do this better. Even the enemies here are all the same colour. I might have thought that for older systems like the Amstrad CPC or even the C64, but for a 16-bit computer like the Amiga, this game is extremely poor. It's also likely the worst Amiga arcade conversion I've ever covered so far in this arcade port series. You know, these 16-bit computer releases originally cost $24.99 in the UK on release. With today's inflation, that would have cost just under £70. If you paid for this release at the time, I bet you would have been very angry. I know I would have been. Next up we have the Commodore Amiga. So regretfully, Shinobi on the Amiga is playable but really fairly just a mediocre arcade conversion, given its ability to have looked and sounded much better given the Amiga's hardware. The first thing very noticeable is how ugly the game looks and how dull and uninspired the colours look. Not quite as ugly as the ST conversion. The music itself kind of sounds like it has the right idea but has dropped a key in sound. just like the Atari ST version. Game also suffers from jerky frame rates. The only thing I will praise this port for is the bonus rounds. The music actually sounds better during these parts, believe it or not. Very sad to think that an 8-bit system could produce better than this 16-bit version. Collision detection, however, is pretty tight though, so the Atari ST and the Amiga versions are very similar. The Commodore Amiga Ocean conversion looks nice and very faithful to the arcade game too, just like the previous Atari ST version. The one thing that Ocean did wrong with this port was mess up the speed of it. Of course, this game for the Amiga is very choppy. I am not saying it's not playable by any means, just like the Atari ST version, but frame rates could have been adjusted a slight. We look at other Amiga racing games such as Jaguar XJ220, and it is clear that smoothness in racing titles could be achieved with the Amiga, but after all, this is Ocean. And of course, they released a fair amount of half-finished games in their Manchester headquarters back in the day. This version is so faithful that it even includes the motorbike surrounding the enemy vehicle at the end of stage 1. And not every port actually did this. It still makes me laugh how kids today think they have it so bad if a piece of texture hasn't rendered correctly. End of the world! They simply don't get it. To add more to this, it even included a massive arrow for the end boss. Such a real shame about this version, but we can thank Ocean for this, of course.
Stop talking nonsense. I know nothing. It's Bob the Boss.
In terms of presentation, the Commodore Amiga conversion looked promising, but I have been there and done this before and will say now, the looks are seriously where it ends. Although like many more conversions, you'll see for this game that the difficulty level isn't as bad as some. The main issue with this Amiga game is its severe lag. It features severe input delay too. For an Amiga game, there is little features that are missing here. A higher end computer compared to 8-bit computers could have at least added some moving clouds to make it look a little bit more authentic to what it's trying to imitate. But nope, we don't even get that here with the Amiga version. Just like the MS-DOS version, this version also features 4 countries to choose from, although it is pointless because this game is just hands down diabolical. Going back to presentation, it does look faithful in a way, but for an Amiga game, the colour palette is very dull. It's just a very embarrassing conversion on a decent 16-bit computer. Shame on you, Turtex. Now, as much as this is an issue and it could be adjusted with display settings, the Commodore Amiga conversion actually came with a palette color bug, which meant that by default the display looked very dark. I did not mess with the video settings as we are showcasing how games looked originally, and this is likely the issue you may have had back in the day where you had to adjust your monitor or your TV. Looks wise, despite that annoyance, it controls and looks good, resembling the 1989 arcade States game really nicely. Music is very good here too, but no sound effects, which is a little irritating considering this is after all a 16-bit home computer port. Everything controls nicely here and not much going wrong in terms of frame drops either. The music in the next conversion truly blows the socks off this Amiga conversion though. It's truly a shame that this version had the color palette bug, otherwise this would have clearly ranked much higher. Having played the Atari ST conversion prior to this Amiga version, I was convinced this one would be better. It normally is the way. Amiga or ST normally has a better version than the other platform. What can I say about this Activision 1988 release? Well, just like the Atari ST version, it looks a lot like Afterburner, but plays badly. Sure, frame drops aren't as bad with this Amiga European release, but just plays equally as bad really. Planes zoom in front, behind, and they just look so bad in terms of scale. Collision detection works when it wants to. One good feature here is the floor area scrolls fairly nicely. Gameplay wise is pretty much non-existent here.